We're starting in the Caribbean, where Hurricane Melissa has now slammed into eastern Cuba. Cuban authorities say more than 700,000 people have been evacuated, with forecasters warning that Melissa could unleash catastrophic damage in and around Santiago de Cuba. That's the country's second biggest city. The hurricane was downgraded to a still powerful Category 3 storm after pounding Jamaica. Jamaican authorities have declared the entire island a disaster area and are warning residents that flooding and landslides remain a serious risk.
When Hurricane Melissa slammed into Jamaica, it was the most powerful storm to make landfall ever recorded. Winds of almost 300 kilometres per hour pounded the coast, with authorities calling it the worst-case scenario.
Jamaica has gone through what I can call one of its worst periods. Our infrastructure has been severely compromised. St. Elizabeth is the breadbasket of the country, and that has taken a beating. The entire Jamaica has felt the brunt of Melissa.
At the peak of its power, the storm smashed buildings, tore down trees and sent water surging into the streets of the capital, Kingston. But the eye of the storm didn't directly hit the city, and residents are grateful.
The fact that we take a wide turn and go around, it benefits me. I'm really sorry for who it really touched, because they're my fellow Jamaicans and we are in love.
If you look at it, it would be like we getting some dangerous thing and it just divert and shift and take it to most of the countryside. I was saying, yeah, God is saying something to somebody down there.
Hurricane Melissa sliced through Jamaica before making its way to Cuba, about 100 kilometres to the north. While the storm has been downgraded, the impact is expected to be fierce.
There will be much work to do. We know that there will be a lot of damage caused by this hurricane, but we have all the capacity to recover.
Once the storm has passed, the focus will shift to recovery for both islands. But authorities in Jamaica have already warned it will be slow going.
I'm joined now by Dr. Helen Hooker. She's a meteorologist and hydrologist specialising in research on the impacts of climate change at the University of Reading in the UK. Thanks so much for joining us, Helen. Hurricane Melissa is obviously making the history books in terms of its strength and impact. Can you tell us what's most unusual about this storm from a meteorological point of view?
Yes, sure. So I think the unusual aspects of Hurricane Melissa, I think particularly the way that it rapidly intensified, so became extremely strong over the Atlantic and the Caribbean seas as it approached Jamaica. And actually, because it was moving extremely slowly, it enabled it to deepen very quickly. And then it sustained a Category 5 status for a considerable amount of time, which is unusual for a hurricane this late in the hurricane season.
So if we're talking about or looking at its sort of incredibly rapid intensification, is that also fueled by warming sea surface temperatures?
Yes, exactly. So we know that the Caribbean Sea at the moment is around 1.5 to 2 degrees above what would be termed usual for this time of year. So exceptional heat in the ocean, which we know has been absorbed from our warmer climate. And this really gives the fuel to the hurricane and enables it to deepen and become incredibly strong.
Is it unusual to see such a big storm this late in the year?
Well, usually we have the peak of the hurricane season in September, but what we're seeing in recent years is actually the hurricane season lengthening. So we had Hurricane Beryl earlier in the season, and now we have Hurricane Melissa later in the season at a very high category, and in fact the highest landfall intensity or strength ever recorded in the Atlantic Ocean.
So apart from the warming ocean temperatures that you were just talking about, how else is climate change driving this new pattern?
Well, I think climate change in particular is impacting the amount of rainfall we're now getting from hurricanes. So the warm ocean can give extra moisture, and this is drawn up into the hurricane. And with it moving quite slowly, it meant that an exceptional amount of moisture was held within the hurricane. And then as it moves over land, all of that moisture then falls as rainfall, and it can now fall more heavily. So there's more intense rainfall than without climate change, which means it accumulates quickly, and then this then leads to the devastating impacts that we've seen, such as flooding and landslides.
If we can talk about the path that Hurricane Melissa is taking, it looks quite erratic. What factors play into how and where it travels?
Yeah, so this depends on the meteorological situation kind of across a wider area. So where there are high pressures and low pressures, and these actually steer the hurricane on its track. So it's taking its kind of usual path now. So it tracked westwards across the Atlantic, and then it will turn and then travel northwards, and then it will actually go back across the Atlantic eventually as it decays. So I think this is a fairly usual pattern for hurricanes. And then the speed at which they travel can vary. And we've seen with Melissa, as it crossed and approached Jamaica, it was traveling extremely slowly. It's now moving a bit quicker, but still expected to bring further impacts to those Caribbean islands in its path.
And in terms of those impacts and Melissa's behaviour, what lessons can we learn? What lessons can coastal communities in particular learn from Hurricane Melissa?
Well, I think Hurricane Melissa was extremely well forecast, and I think islands such as Jamaica seemed incredibly well prepared in good time. And I think that's because of the improvements in the forecast, particularly of the track where the hurricane is going to travel, which really helps to minimize impacts. Although with a hurricane of this strength, there's only so much you can do to protect infrastructure. I think lives can be saved by moving people out of harm's way, but probably, I guess, improvements to infrastructure and protection is probably what will be needed going forwards.
Helen Hooker from the University of Reading. Helen, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Meteorologist Matthew Cappucci is tracking the storm. I asked him if the downgrading of the hurricane is good news for countries still in its path.
It is from a wind standpoint. So when we talk about hurricane ratings, this category 1 through 5 system, that refers to the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. But that only ascribes ratings based on wind speed, not necessarily how much rain is coming down and not the storm surge, that wall of water pushed against the coastline. And so, yes, the winds aren't quite as bad as they were before, but still, as soon as Melissa pulled away from Jamaica, it began re-intensifying once again over the incredibly warm Caribbean waters north of Jamaica. So this thing is still packing quite the punch. And it's also going to push water against the coast and lead to heavy rainfall. One thing I found very interesting in that story you ran a moment ago, the woman described the deafening noise of the hurricane. For anyone who hasn't lived through a hurricane before, you can't imagine the roar outside. It's like standing next to a waterfall for 12 hours on end, all the air rushing past you, the fluid rushing past you. The experience people in eastern Cuba are about to go through will be an incredibly memorable one, and I do hope folks there have taken precautions.
Matthew, you track hurricanes regularly. Is this one, Hurricane Melissa, developing the way you expected?
You know, in meteorology, there's this figure called potential intensity. It's actually a mathematical equation and a mathematical idea created by a brilliant hurricane researcher at MIT called Carrie Emanuel. He's an amazing guy. And it's basically, if you had ideal conditions in the atmosphere, what's the maximum a hurricane could reach? What's the high-end ceiling? It's usually a theoretical value. Melissa got incredibly close to this ceiling, which is something we very rarely see. It had extremely warm water temperatures, favorable winds in the upper atmosphere, robust moisture. Every box was checked off. And so while I knew it was possible for a storm to get this strong in theory, to have that happen and continue intensifying into a landmass with 2.8 million people on it, is something sort of unprecedented in the modern era in the Western Hemisphere.
How does this hurricane compare to others that have struck the Caribbean in the past? Are we seeing a new pattern emerging here, Matthew?
I think that's a very good question, and one I should answer with a little bit of nuance in that, overall, every 5-10 years, somewhere in the Caribbean, we'll see a Category 5 hurricane. Very rarely do you have a landmass that is this populous in the crosshairs. Back in 2019, we saw a Category 5 Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas and then sort of stall over the same area. So Category 5s do happen from time to time, but we're noticing that with climate change, we have a tendency for more rapid intensification and sort of a higher ceiling to storms, especially as water temperatures warm. Interestingly, worldwide, for whatever reason, there are about 90 tropical cyclones globally every single year, and that number should roughly stay the same or actually decrease a little bit thanks to climate change. But the storms that form, more intense and strengthening faster.
Matthew, thank you very much. That was meteorologist Matthew Cappucci in Washington.